Now, my boy, come on a little closer to the fire. Don't mind the rain tapping softly against the cabin roof. Hear that gentle rhythm? Folks nowadays might call it a rainy night, but back in my grandfather's day, that sound was about as comforting as an old quilt fresh from the clothesline. It wrapped itself around a little log cabin like the Lord himself was humming a lullaby. Go on and settle into that old rocking chair. The fire's burning low and steady, and there's plenty of room here beside me. I reckon these old bones have gathered enough stories over 75 years to keep us company until your eyelids grow heavy. You know, there's something people often wonder about. Why did our grandparents always seem to head off to bed so early? It wasn't because life lacked excitement. And it surely wasn't because someone told them they had to. No, truth be told, evening meant something altogether different back then. You see, when my grandfather looked out through those little cabin windows and watched the last streaks of golden sunlight slip behind the hills, he wasn't watching the end of another busy day. He was watching the world gently tuck itself in. The birds grew quiet one by one. The horses settled into the barn with slow, peaceful breaths. Even the wind seemed to soften as if it knew not to disturb the stillness that belonged to evening. Grandfather used to smile whenever that happened. He'd lean back in his old wooden chair, fold his weathered hands across his lap, and quietly say, "Silas, the Lord built the day for working and the night for resting." At the time, I was just a curious little boy with more questions than patience. I'd peek through the window, hoping maybe something exciting might happen after dark. Perhaps travelers would arrive. Perhaps wild animals would wander near the fence. Perhaps the stars themselves might whisper secrets only children could hear. But Grandfather never hurried toward the night. He welcomed it like an old friend returning home. That puzzled me for many years. Nowadays, many homes stay bright long after sunset. Lamps glow, voices carry on, and the hours seem to stretch deep into the night. But our little pioneer cabin lived by a different rhythm, one set not by clocks alone, but by the sun, the seasons, and simple habits passed from one generation to the next. As daylight slowly faded, nobody sighed because the day was ending. Instead, everyone seemed to breathe a little slower. The chores were mostly finished before darkness arrived. Firewood rested neatly beside the hearth. Water buckets stood full by the door. The chickens had found their roosts, and the milk pails had already been washed clean. There was a quiet kind of satisfaction that settled over the family. Not the loud excitement that comes after winning something. No, it was the peaceful feeling that comes from knowing your hands had done honest work. I can still remember the smell of fresh pine logs warming beside the fireplace, the scent mixed with cornbread lingering from supper, and just a touch of cinnamon that my grandmother loved to sprinkle into warm apple preserves whenever she could spare a little. Those smells seemed to tell everyone the very same thing. The day's work was over. It was time to come home, not only to the cabin, but to each other. My grandmother would smooth the wrinkles from the tablecloth with gentle hands that had baked bread, mended shirts, and comforted little hearts all in the same day. Grandfather would remove his worn boots near the doorway, careful not to carry too much dirt across the wooden floor. No one rushed. No one spoke loudly. Even us children somehow knew that evening belonged to gentleness. Looking back now, I reckon that may have been the greatest lesson of all. Before anyone ever thought about going to bed, they first learned how to slow down. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is where our story truly begins. The evening never arrived all at once in those days. It drifted in slowly, almost so gently that if you weren't paying close attention, you might miss the very moment when the daylight surrendered itself to dusk. Now, my boy, I can still picture those evenings as clearly as the dancing flames before us tonight. The sun would slip lower beyond the oak trees, painting the sky with warm shades of amber and faded rose. Shadows stretched across the fields, growing longer with every passing minute, until even the old split-rail fence seemed ready for its own night's rest. Grandfather always noticed these little changes. "I reckon it's about time," he'd say with a quiet smile, never needing to look at a clock. You see, clocks were useful enough, but nature was the finest timekeeper a family could ever have. The chirping of the crickets, the distant call of a whip-poor-will, the cool evening breeze wandering through the trees. Each one whispered the same simple message. The day had done its work. Inside the cabin, everyone moved with an easy rhythm that had been practiced so many times it needed no instruction. Mother folded the last clean apron and placed it neatly on a wooden peg. My older sisters gathered the sewing basket, carefully winding each thread so nothing would be wasted. My brothers stacked another armful of firewood beside the hearth, enough to keep the cabin warm until morning. And well, truth be told, I usually found one more excuse to stay outside. Perhaps I'd watch the chickens settling onto their roosts. Perhaps I'd stand beside the little creek, listening to the water glide over smooth stones. Or perhaps I'd simply look up at the evening sky, wondering how many stars would appear before Grandfather called me in. It never took long. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. "Silas, come on in, my boy." Those few words carried more warmth than any shout ever could. I'd hurry toward the cabin, brushing the dust from my trousers before stepping onto the porch. The moment I opened the door, a different world welcomed me. Outside belonged to the fading daylight. Inside belonged to family. The fireplace crackled softly. Its golden light danced across the log walls, making every knot in the wood seem alive with quiet stories of its own. There were no bright electric lights filling every corner, only the warm glow of fire, and soon enough, a few carefully tended candles. That gentle light changed everything. Faces looked softer. Voices naturally became quieter. No one felt hurried. Even time itself seemed to slow its pace. Grandmother often said that bright light keeps a body awake, but gentle light reminds the heart to grow peaceful. I didn't understand her words back then. I simply knew the cabin felt different after sunset. Safer somehow. Warmer. Almost like the whole world had shrunk down to one room where everyone belonged. Before any candle was lit, Grandmother would carefully trim the old wick with tiny scissors she kept tucked inside her sewing basket. Nothing was wasted. A candle represented hours of patient work. The bees had made the wax. Someone had gathered it. Someone had melted and shaped it. So every evening, that little flame was treated with quiet respect. Grandfather struck the flint. A tiny spark leapt into life. Then another. Finally, the wick caught. The small flame flickered for a moment before standing steady, casting its warm glow across the table. I used to stare at that single candle. It wasn't powerful enough to chase every shadow from the room. Instead, it simply offered enough light for the people gathered close together. Looking back now, I think there's a lesson hidden there. Not every darkness must be driven away. Sometimes all we need is enough light to see the faces we love. The corners of the cabin remained softly dim. The beams above disappeared into gentle shadow. Outside, the rain or the wind could carry on as they pleased. Inside, peace had already settled in. Grandfather would lean back, warming his hands near the fire. No one reached for another task. No one searched for more work just to stay busy. The evening had its own purpose. It was teaching tired hands how to become still. And little by little, as the fire whispered and the candle glowed, our family began preparing for the sweetest part of the night, gathering together around the supper table.
Now, my boy, if there was one moment every evening that seemed to gather the whole day into a single peaceful breath, it was supper. Not a grand feast, not a table overflowing with riches, just enough. And somehow, enough always felt like plenty. By the time everyone found their places around the old pine table, the sky outside had turned a deep blue, and the first stars were beginning to peek through the clouds whenever the rain paused for a spell. The cabin grew wonderfully quiet. No one rushed to be first. No one complained about waiting. You see, after a day spent working from sunrise until dusk, even the smallest meal tasted like a blessing. Grandmother would carry over a cast iron pot with both hands, careful not to spill a single drop. Steam curled into the air, carrying the comforting scent of vegetable stew seasoned with onions, carrots, potatoes, and herbs she'd gathered from the little garden beside the cabin. Some evenings there was fresh cornbread. Other nights, thick slices of homemade bread still warm from the oven, waiting patiently beside a crock of butter. If the hens had been generous, there might be eggs. If the fishing had gone well, perhaps a little trout from the creek. And when autumn had filled the cellar shelves, sweet apple preserves often made their quiet appearance beside the bread. Truth be told, I never realized how simple our meals were until many years later. As a little boy, they seemed fit for kings. Perhaps because they were seasoned with something no recipe could ever teach: gratitude. Before anyone lifted a spoon, Grandfather would remove his old hat and bow his silver head. The room became so still that even the crackling fire sounded louder. His prayers were never long. He didn't search for fancy words. He simply spoke from a thankful heart. Lord, thank you for another day's strength. Thank you for this food, this roof, and these hands gathered together. Bless those who have less than we do, and help us wake ready for tomorrow's work. Amen. Amen, the family answered together. Even as a child, I loved that moment. Not because the meal was finally beginning, but because those few quiet seconds made everything feel whole. Grandmother always believed that food filled the stomach, but gratitude filled the soul. I reckon she was right. The spoons clinked softly against the bowls. Nobody hurried through supper. There was no reason to. The night wasn't going anywhere. Between bites, stories wandered around the table as easily as the bread basket. Grandfather might tell us about spotting a young deer near the creek that morning. Mother would laugh gently about one stubborn chicken that refused to stay inside the fence. My sisters shared little triumphs from their sewing, while my brother spoke proudly of chopping straighter logs than the week before. And every now and then, someone would simply smile without saying anything at all. Silence wasn't awkward in our cabin. It belonged there. You see, people didn't feel the need to fill every quiet moment with words. Sometimes the happiest families are the ones who know how to enjoy each other's company without speaking. I remember once asking Grandfather why everyone seemed so peaceful at supper. He smiled, tore off a small piece of bread, and looked toward the fire before answering. "Silas, a hungry body needs food. A tired heart needs family." Those words stayed with me longer than I could have imagined. Years passed. The little boy asking questions became an old man telling stories. Yet whenever I sit beside a warm fire and hear the gentle patter of rain, I can almost see that table again. The bowls, the candlelight, the smiles that never needed to be loud, the feeling that every person in the room belonged exactly where they were. No one looked toward tomorrow's worries. Today's work had been finished. Tomorrow would come in its own time. For now there was only supper, the warmth of the cabin, and the quiet blessing of being together. And when the last crumbs had been gathered and the bowls carefully washed, another cherished evening tradition quietly waited to begin, one that filled the cabin not with the aroma of food, but with words that nourished the heart just as deeply.
Now, my boy, once the supper dishes had been washed and carefully dried with grandmother's favorite linen towel, the cabin would grow quieter still. Not because anyone had been told to hush. It simply happened. You see, evening carried its own kind of gentleness, and everyone seemed willing to follow its lead. Grandmother would stack the plates neatly upon the wooden shelf, making sure each one rested safely against the next. She always smiled after putting away the last bowl, almost as though finishing that simple task was her way of saying thank you for another day. The fire continued its soft conversation with the logs, a steady crackle, a gentle pop. Every now and then a tiny spark would dance upward before fading into nothing at all. To this very day, I reckon, there are few sounds more comforting than a peaceful fireplace after supper. Grandfather would take a long, slow breath before rising from his chair. His knees weren't as strong as they once been, though I didn't notice that much as a little boy. I only knew that every movement he made seemed thoughtful, never hurried, never wasted. He'd walk over to the small wooden shelf tucked beside the chimney. There rested the family's Bible, It wasn't fancy. The leather cover had grown smooth from years of careful hands opening it. Its corners were worn. Several pages carried little notes written in faded ink. Births, marriages, the passing of loved ones. Little reminders that one family had walked many years beneath God's care. Grandfather would lift the Bible as gently as if he were carrying something precious, because to him he truly was. Now, my boy, there wasn't a single evening when he forced us to listen. He never raised his voice. He never scolded if one of us children grew sleepy. He simply invited us closer. Come gather round. Those words still warm my heart. We'd pull our chairs nearer to the fire. Sometimes I'd sit cross-legged on the braided rug. Other evenings I'd lean against grandmother's rocking chair, listening to its slow creak as she gently rocked beside me. Outside, darkness settled fully across the valley. The rain might still be falling, or perhaps snowflakes drifted quietly through the moonlight. Sometimes the wind wandered through the pine trees with a low, peaceful sigh. But inside our little cabin, everything felt wonderfully safe. Grandfather opened the Bible. The pages whispered as they turned. Even now I can almost hear that familiar sound. He often began with the book of Psalms, not because someone had told him it was the proper place, but because those verses seemed to fit the evening as naturally as stars fit the night sky. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind that filled a church building. It was calm, warm, steady, the sort of voice that made every word feel like it belonged exactly where it was. As children, we didn't understand every passage. Truth be told, sometimes my mind wandered. I'd watch the candle flame sway ever so slightly. I'd wonder what the horses were dreaming about in the barn. I'd count the knots in the ceiling beams. Yet, somehow, those gentle readings found their way into my heart anyway. Perhaps that's the way wisdom often works. It settles quietly while we're busy simply being present. After reading a few verses, Grandfather would close the Bible without rushing. No speeches followed, no long explanations, just a peaceful silence, a silence that allowed the words to rest inside each of us. I learned many years later that silence can be just as meaningful as conversation. Not every lesson needs more words. Some lessons simply need a quiet place to grow. Grandmother would smile softly across the room. Mother might reach over and straighten a loose strand of my sister's hair. One of my brothers would quietly add another small log to the fire. These tiny acts of care seemed almost invisible at the time, yet looking back, I believe they were the threads that stitched our family together. The Bible reading was never only about the words upon the page. It was about gathering, about slowing down, about remembering that before sleep came, our hearts should grow as peaceful as the night outside. And when the final page had been gently closed, Grandfather would bow his head once more, for there was one last evening tradition our family never wished to miss, the quiet prayer that carried every hope, every worry, and every thankful heart into the hands of the Lord.
Now, my boy, if there was one moment that brought a deep and gentle stillness over our little cabin, it was the evening prayer. Not because anyone demanded silence, but because every heart seemed to know it was time to rest, not only the body, but the soul as well. Grandfather would leave the Bible resting upon the table, its pages still open where he had been reading. The candle beside it burned with a calm little flame, never rushing, never wavering for long. Its light stretched softly across the room. Outside, the rain often continued its quiet song upon the roof. Drip, drip, drip. To this day, whenever I hear rain on an old roof, I cannot help but think of those evenings. I reckon memory has a funny way of hiding itself inside the smallest sounds. Grandfather would remove his spectacles and place them carefully beside the Bible. Then he'd look around the room, not to see whether everyone was paying attention. Nah, he simply looked upon the people he loved. His eyes rested on Grandmother first, then Mother, then each of us children. Every face mattered. Every person belonged. Finally, he would nod ever so slightly. "Well now," he'd say in that calm voice of his, "let's thank the good Lord before we borrow another night's rest." I always liked the way he said that, borrow another night's rest, as though sleep itself were a precious gift entrusted to us until morning. We all bowed our heads. Some folded their hands, some simply rested them in their laps. Even the youngest among us grew remarkably still. No one had to remind us. The quiet invited us all by itself. Grandfather never hurried through his prayers. Neither did he speak as though trying to impress anyone. He talked to the Lord the same way an old friend speaks to another old friend, with honesty, with gratitude, with peace. He thanked God for the harvest, whether it had been plentiful or modest. He thanked Him for healthy animals, for rain when the fields were dry, for sunshine after long storms, for neighbors who shared burdens without expecting anything in return. Sometimes he prayed for families living many miles away whom we had never met. Other evenings he remembered someone who had fallen ill or lost a loved one. As a boy, I often wondered how Grandfather managed to care about so many people. Years later, I finally understood. A peaceful heart has room for others. That was one of his quiet lessons, not spoken, simply lived. When the prayer ended, no one sprang to their feet. There was no rush to begin the next task. Instead, we remained seated for another little while, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire. Sometimes Grandmother would reach over and give Grandfather a soft squeeze. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. After so many years together, love often spoke without words. I used to watch them and wonder if growing old always looked so peaceful. Truth be told, back then, I imagined old age must surely be the happiest season of life. Now that I've reached those years myself, I reckon I wasn't too far from the truth. Growing older doesn't mean every day becomes easy. It simply teaches you which things are worth carrying.
Now, my boy, after the prayers had been softly spoken and every thankful heart had grown a little lighter, no one hurried away to their bed. There was still a little while left for the evening to unfold. Not much, just enough. I reckon those quiet minutes by the fire became some of the sweetest memories of my whole childhood. The flames had settled into glowing embers by then, casting a warm orange light across the cabin walls. Every now and again, a log would sigh and shift, sending a tiny shower of sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the rain had become gentler still. It sounded less like a storm and more like a lullaby. Grandmother would return to her rocking chair, the one Grandfather had built for her not long after they were married. Its wooden runners had worn smooth over the years. Back and forth, back and forth. The slow creaking of that chair became part of the evening itself. If I close my eyes even now, I can almost hear it. Mother would often bring out a basket filled with little mending jobs, a shirt with a loose button, a worn sleeve needing another careful stitch, a sock that had faithfully served one season too many. She never complained about such work. Truth be told, she often hummed the softest little hymns while her needle moved through the cloth. No one applauded her. No one thought twice about it. It was simply another quiet act of love. Grandfather, meanwhile, liked to carve. Nothing grand, perhaps a new spoon, a toy horse for one of the younger children, or a fresh handle for an old hammer. His pocket knife moved slowly over the piece of wood, shaving away thin curls that drifted gently onto the floor. I used to gather those little curls in my hands. They smelled of fresh cedar and pine. To a little boy, they seemed as precious as treasure. "Come here, Silas," Grandfather would say. I'd scoot my stool closer until I could watch every careful movement. "You see," he'd tell me, holding up the unfinished spoon, "wood don't like to be hurried." I would look at him with puzzled eyes. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" He'd smile beneath his silver beard. "If you force it, it'll split." He'd pause for a moment before adding, People are a little like that too. Those words settled quietly inside me. I didn't fully understand them then, but over the years, life proved them true more times than I can count. People aren't meant to be rushed through every hour. Hearts need quiet. Minds need stillness. Souls need rest. Perhaps our grandparents knew that long before anyone gave it a name. Sometimes my brothers would ask grandfather about his younger days. What was your pa like? Did you ever get lost in the woods? Were winters colder back then? He always answered with a gentle chuckle. Oh, I reckon every winter feels colder when you're young. Then another story would begin. Not a dramatic tale, nothing meant to impress, just simple memories of planting corn with his father, learning to split wood fire straight, watching the first snowfall of the season, or walking home beneath a sky so full of stars that the whole world seemed wrapped in heaven's blanket. Those stories carried no grand heroes, only ordinary people trying to live faithfully. Looking back now, I think that's why they stayed with me. They reminded me that an ordinary life can be a beautiful one. You don't need great adventures every day. Sometimes the greatest blessing is simply sharing one peaceful evening with those you love. As the stories drifted through the cabin, the younger children began leaning against their mothers. Tiny yawns escaped every now and then. One little head rested upon a shoulder. Another pair of sleepy eyes blinked more slowly with each passing minute. No one teased them for growing tired. In fact, Grandfather would smile whenever he noticed. "The night's calling," he'd whisper. "It knows when little folks have had enough." The fire burned lower. The candle flame grew smaller. The room became quieter than before. It was as though the cabin itself was gently encouraging everyone to let go of the day. And soon Grandmother would rise with a kind smile, knowing it was time for one of the coziest traditions of all, making the little cabin ready for sleep, one peaceful step at a time.
Now, my boy, by the time the stories had found their gentle ending, the cabin itself seemed ready to yawn. Not in the way people do, of course, but everything inside that little home appeared to settle into a peaceful hush. The fire had burned down into glowing embers, their warm light pulsing softly beneath a blanket of white ash. The candle on the table flickered with a smaller flame now, as though it too knew its day's work was nearly done. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. Only the occasional drop slipped from the roof and landed upon the ground below. The whole valley felt wrapped in quiet. Grandmother would rise from her rocking chair with the same gentle grace she carried through every part of the day. "I reckon it's time to make the cabin cozy for the night," she'd say with a smile. That was everyone's signal. No one groaned, no one wished for another hour. Even as children, bedtime didn't feel like the end of happiness. It felt like part of it. Mother folded the tablecloth with careful hands, smoothing each corner before placing it neatly inside the old wooden chest.
The supper dishes were already dry, shining softly in the candlelight as they rested upon their shelf. My brothers checked the cabin door one last time, not out of fear, simply out of good habit. Grandfather always believed that peaceful sleep began with faithful preparation. Do the little things before bed, he'd often say, and your mind won't wander after your head meets the pillow. At the time, I thought he was talking only about chores. Years later, I realized he was speaking about life itself. When we finish what we reasonably can, our hearts find it much easier to rest. One of my favorite jobs belonged to me. I was trusted to help Grandfather with the lantern. Now, my boy, that may not sound like much, but to a little fellow, it felt like an important responsibility. The lantern hung beside the cabin door, its glass chimney warm from the evening. Grandfather would lift it down carefully and place it upon the table. "Easy now, Silas," he'd whisper. "We treat light kindly." He showed me how to lower the wick just enough, not too quickly, not too slowly. The little flame became smaller and softer until it glowed like a tiny golden star. Then, with one gentle breath, he would blow it out. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward, carrying that familiar scent of warm oil and singed wick. For a brief moment, the cabin grew noticeably darker. Not frighteningly dark, simply peaceful. The fire still painted gentle shadows across the walls, and that was more than enough. You see, people back then did not try to turn night into day. They welcomed the darkness. They understood that every evening carried its own quiet purpose. Darkness wasn't something to fight. It was nature's way of inviting every living creature to slow down. I remember asking Grandfather once, "Don't you wish we had more light?" He looked towards the glowing fireplace before answering. "Oh, no, my boy," he smiled, that slow, thoughtful smile of his. "If the Lord wanted us awake all night, He'd have left the sun in the sky." I laughed then, but the older I've become, the wiser those simple words have seemed. Perhaps that's one reason our grandparents slept so deeply. When darkness arrived, they accepted its invitation. There were no endless distractions calling for attention, no endless noise asking them to stay awake just a little longer. The fading fire, the dim lantern, and the quiet night all worked together like old friends, gently leading everyone toward rest. Grandmother would fluff each feather pillow and straighten every handmade quilt with loving care. Those quilts had been stitched over many long winters. Each square held a memory, a piece of Father's old work shirt, a bit of Mother's faded Sunday dress, a scrap from a child's outgrown blanket. Our family wasn't simply sleeping beneath warm fabric. We were resting beneath years of shared love and patient hands. As I watched Grandmother smooth the last quilt across the bed, I began to understand something without anyone seeing it out loud. Preparing for sleep wasn't merely another chore. It was a quiet ritual, a quiet way of telling the body, the mind, and the heart the day is complete.
And as the last glowing embers whispered softly within the hearth, Grandfather invited me to step outside with him for just a moment, where the cool night air and a sky filled with stars would leave me with a lesson I would carry for the rest of my life. Now, my boy, just before everyone turned in for the night, Grandfather had a little habit that belonged only to the two of us. He'd reach for his old wool coat, drape it across his shoulders, and give me a gentle nod. "Come along, Silas." That was all he had to say. I'd slip on my little boots as quietly as I could, careful not to wake the youngest children who were already drifting toward sleep beneath their quilts. Grandmother would smile as we opened the cabin door. "Don't stay out too long," she'd whisper. Grandfather would tip his hat with a grin. "We'll only borrow a minute from the night." The cool evening air greeted us like an old friend. The rain had passed now, leaving behind the sweet scent of damp earth and pine needles. Tiny drops still clung to the branches, catching what little moonlight peeked through the drifting clouds. Everything felt washed clean. The little cabin behind us glowed warmly through its windows, the firelight flickering softly inside. Whenever I looked back, it reminded me of a lantern resting in the middle of a great, quiet sea of darkness. Grandfather stood silently for a while. He never felt the need to speak right away. You see, he believed that nature had its own stories to tell if only a person would listen. So we listened. The breeze wandered gently through the trees. Somewhere far across the meadow an owl called once before falling silent again. The horses shifted lazily in the barn. Even the creek seemed to murmur more softly than it had during the day. It was as though the whole countryside had agreed to speak in whispers. After a few moments, Grandfather slowly pointed upward. "There now, my boy." I followed his finger. The clouds had begun to part. One by one, stars appeared across the heavens. First a handful, then dozens, then more than I could ever hope to count. To a little boy, the sky looked endless. I remember asking him, "Grandpa, who lights all those stars?" He chuckled quietly, his beard catching the moonlight. "I reckon the same loving hands that wake the flowers each spring." That answer satisfied me completely. Children have a wonderful way of accepting simple truths. We stood there for a long while without saying another word. Nowadays, silence sometimes makes folks uncomfortable, but back then, silence felt like company. No one reached for entertainment. No one searched for another distraction. The stars were enough. The breeze was enough. Being together was enough. Grandfather finally broke the silence. "You know why people sleep so well out here, Silas?" I shook my head. He smiled. "Because the world slows down with us." I looked around the quiet valley. Nothing seemed to be in a hurry. The trees weren't rushing. The creek wasn't rushing. The moon wasn't rushing across the sky.
Everything moved in its own gentle time. Grandfather rested one weathered hand upon my shoulder. People are happiest when they stop trying to outrun the day. At the time, I thought he meant running through the fields. Many years later, I understood he was talking about something much deeper, life itself. There will always be another fence to mend, another field to plow, another basket to fill. The work never truly ends, but every evening offers a choice to carry tomorrow's burdens or to lay them down until morning. Our grandparents seemed to understand that better than most. When darkness came, they didn't see unfinished chores. They saw permission to rest, permission to trust that the sun would rise again. Grandfather took one final look at the stars before turning back toward the cabin. "Come along, my boy," he said softly. "The beds have been waiting patiently for us." His words always made me smile, as though even the feather mattresses and handmade quilts were faithful old friends, quietly waiting to welcome tired souls home. We stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind us. The warmth of the fire embraced us once again. The cabin had grown wonderfully still. Only a few glowing embers remained in the hearth, filling the room with a soft amber light. It was nearly time for everyone to settle beneath their quilts, but before sleep claimed the house, Grandmother had one final tender tradition, one that wrapped every child in love as surely as the blankets wrapped around our shoulders.
Now, my boy, once Grandfather and I stepped quietly back into the cabin, the warmth welcomed us as though we'd never left. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing coals, spreading a gentle heat that reached every corner of the room. Shadows moved lazily across the log walls, and the little cabin seemed to breathe with a peaceful rhythm of its own. By then, the youngest children were already rubbing their sleepy eyes. Tiny yawns escaped one after another. No one tried to stay awake just to prove they could. Sleep was never treated as something to resist. It was a faithful friend arriving right on time. Grandmother noticed every little sign. She always did. A drooping eyelid, a slower blink, a child leaning against a parent's shoulder. She would smile with the kindest expression and softly say, "I reckon someone's dreams are knocking." Those simple words always made us laugh quietly. Then she would begin her favorite evening ritual. One by one, she tucked each child beneath a warm quilt. Not hurriedly, not as another task to finish, but with the same loving care she gave to kneading bread or tending her garden. She would smooth the blanket across our shoulders, straighten a corner beneath our chin, brush a loose strand of hair away from our forehead. Sometimes she'd gently rub a little boy's back. Other times she'd simply rest her hand for a moment upon a child's shoulder. Such little things, yet somehow they made the whole cabin feel even safer. Truth be told, I don't remember every story grandmother ever told. I don't remember every meal she cooked. But I do remember how peaceful I felt whenever she tucked me into bed. Some memories stay with us not because of what happened, but because of how deeply they made us feel loved. Grandmother believed bedtime should never be rushed. The last moments of the day, she'd often say, ought to be the gentlest. I reckon she was wiser than she ever claimed to be. Even after all these years, I still think about those words whenever evening comes. Once everyone was comfortably settled, she'd walk quietly around the cabin one last time. She checked that the fire was safe. She made certain the kettle rested where it belonged. She folded an extra blanket across the foot of the bed, just in case the night grew too cold as expected. She thought ahead so no one would wake uncomfortable. That, my boy, is another kind of love, the quiet kind, the sort that asks for nothing in return. I remember one winter evening when the wind howled so loudly outside that the old cabin timbers creaked with every gust. As a little fella, I pulled the quilt a little tighter around my shoulders. Grandmother noticed immediately. Without saying a word, she walked over and tucked another soft blanket around me. Then she smiled. "The wind may sing all night," she whispered, "but it won't trouble you in here." Somehow, I believed her completely. Within moments, my worries drifted away like smoke rising up the chimney. Looking back now, I realize that real comfort isn't found only in thick blankets or warm fires. It's found in knowing someone cares enough to make sure you're at peace. That little cabin wasn't grand. Its walls were rough-hewn logs. Its windows were small. Its furniture was plain. Yet to me, it felt richer than any mansion could have been, because love lived there. Love in the quiet prayers, love around the supper table, love beside the fireplace, love in every quilt carefully stitched by patient hands. Perhaps that's another reason our grandparents welcomed bedtime so willingly. They weren't ending the day alone, they were ending it surrounded by kindness. The cabin grew quieter still. Only the soft ticking of the old clock and the gentle crackle of the embers could be heard. Grandfather settled into his chair for just a few more peaceful moments, his eyes resting on the glowing coals. I climbed beneath my quilt, wondering what thoughts filled his heart as he watched those fading coals. Little did I know, before retiring for the night, he carried one final habit that would leave me with a lesson about gratitude, contentment, and the quiet beauty of an ordinary day.
Now, my boy, before Grandfather ever climbed into his own bed, there was one last quiet custom he kept, almost without fail. It wasn't written in any rule book. No one expected it of him. He simply believed that a day deserved a proper farewell. The cabin had grown wonderfully still by then. My brothers and sisters were tucked beneath their quilts, breathing slow and easy. Grandmother had set her knitting aside, and Mother had whispered a soft good night before disappearing behind the little curtain that gave a bit of privacy to the sleeping corner. The fire no longer crackled as loudly. Instead, it glowed with a gentle warmth, like the steady heartbeat of the cabin itself. Grandfather remained in his chair for a little while longer. His hands rested comfortably upon the smooth arms of the rocker, polished by many years of faithful use. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was simply being still. As a little boy, I often peeked from beneath my quilt to watch him. I wondered why he stayed awake when everyone else had nearly fallen asleep. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I whispered across the room, "Grandpa, aren't you coming to bed?" He looked over with that familiar smile that always reached his kind eyes. "Oh, I will, my boy." He glanced back toward the glowing embers. "But first, I like to thank the day for all it gave." At first, I didn't quite understand. How could someone thank a day? A day wasn't a person. It couldn't hear you. Perhaps he noticed the puzzled look upon my face. He chuckled softly. "You see, Silas, every day leaves us a few gifts." He raised one weathered finger. "Sometimes it's a good harvest. Then another. Sometimes it's a neighbor stopping by for a friendly visit. A third finger. And sometimes it's nothing more than seeing your family safe around the supper table." He nodded gently. "That's enough reason to be thankful." Those words settled over the room as softly as the firelight. From that evening on, I began paying closer attention. Before closing my eyes each night, I'd quietly think about one good thing that had happened. Sometimes it was helping Grandfather gather kindling. Sometimes it was watching bluebirds build a nest beneath the barn roof. Sometimes it was nothing more than sharing a warm biscuit with butter fresh from Grandmother's churn. Funny, isn't it? The happiest memories are so often the simplest ones. Truth be told, our grandparents didn't spend their evenings wishing they'd done more. They found joy in what had already been given. Contentment was as much a part of bedtime as the quilts upon our beds. Grandfather often said, "A thankful heart makes the softest pillow." I've carried those words with me through every season of life. When harvests were plentiful, when winters were long, when joyful days came, and when sorrow visited for a while, gratitude always seemed to lighten the weight upon my shoulders. Outside, the moon climbed a little higher above the trees. Its pale light slipped quietly through the cabin window, resting upon the wooden floor beside the fireplace. The old clock on the mantel ticked patiently, not loudly, not urgently, just steadily, reminding us that time never needed to hurry. Grandfather finally stood, stretched his back with a gentle sigh, and walked over to the hearth. Using the iron poker, he carefully gathered the glowing coals together, not to make the fire burn brighter, only to help it last safely through the night. "There now," he whispered almost to himself, "that ought to do." I remember thinking how lovingly he cared even for the fire. Nothing was neglected, nothing was rushed. Everything had its proper time. Perhaps that's why bedtime came so naturally to them. By the time they laid their heads upon the pillow, every small task had been gently finished, every thankful thought had found its place, and every heart had grown quiet enough to welcome sleep. As Grandfather turned toward his bed, he paused beside my quilt, smiled beneath his silver beard, and softly tucked the blanket around my shoulders one last time. "Sleep well, my boy. Morning will come soon enough." And with those comforting words settling over the cabin like a warm blanket, the house drifted even deeper into silence, preparing for one final stretch of peaceful moments before the whole family surrendered completely to the gentle embrace of the night.
Now, my boy, there comes a moment each evening when a house seems to fall asleep before the people inside it do. Our little cabin had reached that moment. The rocking chair had grown still. The Bible rested quietly upon the table. The candle had long since been extinguished, leaving only the soft glow of the fireplace to paint warm patterns across the floor. Even the old clock seemed to tick more gently, as though it too wished not to disturb the peaceful hush. I lay beneath my quilt with my eyes half closed. The feather mattress settled softly beneath me, and every now and then I could hear someone take a slow, contented breath from another corner of the room. Those sounds became part of the night. Grandmother breathing peacefully, one of my brothers turning over in his sleep, the wind brushing against the cabin walls, the quiet murmur of the creek beyond the trees. Nothing felt lonely. Everything belonged. Truth be told, I don't think we ever tried to make bedtime exciting. We didn't need bedtime stories filled with grand adventures every single night. Life itself had already given us enough to think about. The fields, the garden, the changing weather, the kindness of neighbors, the goodness of the Lord. Those simple things filled a young heart more completely than I realized at the time. Sometimes, just before sleep carried me away, Grandfather would speak once more from his own bed, not loudly, just enough for those still awake to hear. "Silas?" "Yes, Grandpa?" "You know what tomorrow is?" I'd think for a moment before answering. "Wednesday?" He'd laugh softly. "Well, that too." There'd be a little pause. Then he'd say, "It's another chance." Another chance. Those two words stayed with me for the rest of my life. Another chance to do honest work. Another chance to help a neighbor. Another chance to forgive. Another chance to smile. Another chance to thank the Lord for the gift of waking up. Grandfather never spoke about tomorrow with worry. He spoke about it with hope. Perhaps that's because he refused to carry tomorrow into tonight. He trusted morning to bring what morning would bring. And tonight belonged to rest. You see, my boy, our grandparents understood something that many folks quietly forget. The body works best when it knows the day has truly ended. They didn't stretch every evening until midnight searching for one more thing to do. When the chores were finished, they accepted that enough had been done. When the prayers had been spoken, they believed they had been heard. When the family had gathered together, they felt rich beyond measure. That peaceful rhythm wrapped itself around every member of the household. Even the animals seemed to understand it. The horses stood quietly in the barn. The chickens rested upon their roosts without a sound. The old sheepdog curled himself near the porch, lifting one sleepy ear now and then before settling again with a contented sigh. It seemed the whole farm trusted the night. I remember once asking Grandfather if he was ever afraid of the darkness. He answered so gently that I can still hear his voice. "Oh, no, my boy.
The same Lord who watches the sun rise is watching while we sleep. That answer was enough. I stopped wondering whether the darkness held anything to fear. Instead, I began seeing it as a great soft blanket spread gently across the hills, the forests, the fields, and every little cabin tucked between them. The night wasn't empty. It was full of quiet care. As my eyelids grew heavier, the last thing I usually saw was the faint orange glow from the dying embers. They reminded me of tiny stars resting safely inside the hearth. Their warmth lingered even as the flames disappeared. Much like the love of a family, it stayed with you long after the day's busy moments had faded. And just before sleep carried every soul in the cabin into peaceful dreams, Grandfather's gentle breathing blended with the whispering wind outside, teaching me one final lesson about why the earliest bedtimes often brought the sweetest mornings.
Now, my boy, by the time the last ember had settled into a quiet red glow, it almost seemed as though the whole world had tucked itself beneath a great, peaceful blanket. The cabin no longer echoed with conversation. No chairs creaked. No dishes clinked upon the shelves. Only the smallest sounds remained. The steady breathing of a family at rest, the gentle whisper of the wind brushing against the logs, the soft rustle of leaves beyond the window. Those little sounds never disturbed the silence. They became part of it. As a young boy, I often thought the night had its own heartbeat, slow, steady, patient. And somehow, lying beneath my quilt, I felt my own heart begin to match its quiet rhythm. I reckon that's one reason sleep came so naturally. No one fought against the night. We simply joined it. Grandfather used to tell me something that seemed almost too simple to remember, yet I've carried it through every season of my life. Silas, yes, Grandpa? Everything in the Lord's creation knows when to rest. At first, I thought he meant only people, but then I began noticing the world around me. The robins tucked their heads beneath their wings. The cows settled quietly in the pasture. Even the old oak tree outside our cabin seemed perfectly content to stand beneath the stars without asking anything more of the day. Nothing struggled against evening. Nothing hurried to stay awake. Nature trusted tomorrow. And because our family lived so close to that rhythm, we learned to trust it too. Sometimes, just before sleep found me, I'd hear Grandmother whisper one last blessing from across the room. May the Lord keep this house through the night. She said those words so softly that they almost floated upon the warm air. No grand speech, no ceremony, just a quiet prayer wrapped in love. Those simple blessings made our little cabin feel like the safest place in all the world. Years later, after I was grown and living in a cabin of my own, I caught myself whispering those very same words before climbing into bed. No one had told me to. It had simply become part of who I was. That's how family traditions often work. They don't arrive with great fanfare. They settle into your heart one peaceful evening at a time, until one day you realize you're
passing them along without even thinking. Truth be told, I believe our grandparents understood that bedtime was about far more than sleep. It was about closing the day with peace. If someone had spoken harshly during the afternoon, they tried to make things right before the lamps went out. If there had been a misunderstanding, it wasn't allowed to grow through the night. Grandfather believed heavy hearts made restless pillows, so kindness became part of the evening routine. A gentle smile, a quiet apology, a forgiving word. Those little acts were as important as banking the fire or locking the cabin door. Looking back now, I can see why they rested so deeply. They weren't carrying anger into tomorrow. They laid it down beside the fireplace before they laid down their heads. Some evenings, after everyone else had fallen asleep, I'd wake for just a moment. Perhaps the wind had changed. Perhaps an ember had softly cracked within the hearth. I'd open my eyes only long enough to see the faint moonlight slipping through the window. The quilts felt warm. The cabin smelled of pine wood, clean wool blankets, and the last traces of the evening fire. Then, without a single worry upon my little mind, I'd drift right back to sleep. There was never any fear that I was missing anything. The world could wait until sunrise. Morning had its own blessings waiting patiently. Night had already given us everything we needed. And as the hours passed quietly beneath a sky filled with faithful stars, the first gentle promise of dawn began its slow journey toward the little pioneer cabin, carrying with it one final lesson that my grandfather hoped I would never forget.
Now, my boy, before the first light of morning ever touched the hills, there was a quiet kind of magic that lived in those last hours of the night. No one was awake to witness it, or so I thought when I was a little feller. The cabin rested in complete stillness. The fire had become a bed of soft gray ashes, with only the faintest hint of warmth hidden beneath. The moon, having faithfully watched over the valley through the long night, slowly drifted toward the western sky. Outside, the fields lay beneath a silver blanket of dew. The trees stood patiently, their branches hardly moving at all. Even the creek seemed to whisper more softly than it had the evening before. Everything appeared content. Everything appeared exactly where it was meant to be. As I grew older, I began to understand that peace has a way of spreading quietly. A peaceful evening leads to a peaceful night. A peaceful night welcomes a peaceful morning. Grandfather knew that long before I ever did. One spring morning, after I had slept more soundly than I could remember, I asked him why I always felt so rested in our little cabin. He smiled beneath his white beard as he poured fresh water into the kettle. "Well now, Silas," he said, "sleep doesn't begin when your head finds the pillow." I blinked in surprise. "It doesn't?" He shook his head gently. "No, my boy." He stirred the fire with the iron poker before continuing. "Sleep begins with the way you spend your evening." Those words puzzled me then, but as the years rolled by, I found myself remembering them over and over again. You see, by the time bedtime arrived in our home, our hearts had already been prepared. The chores were finished, the supper had been shared, the dishes were cleaned, the prayers had been spoken, the stories had been told, the lantern had been lowered, the worries had been handed over to the Lord. By the time our heads rested upon those feather pillows, there was very little left to carry. Perhaps that's why our grandparents welcomed sleep instead of chasing it. They trusted the gentle rhythm the Lord had woven into every day. Work while the sun shines, gather with those you love when evening comes, rest when darkness settles over the land, wake with gratitude when morning returns. It sounds wonderfully simple because it is. Some of life's deepest wisdom is often the simplest. I reckon that's something my grandfather tried to teach without ever making it feel like a lesson. He simply lived that way, and because he lived it, I learned it. Looking back now, I don't remember many expensive things from my childhood. There weren't any. No grand furniture, no fancy decorations, no riches waiting inside our little cabin. But I do remember warmth. I remember laughter that never needed to be loud. I remember prayers spoken with humble hearts. I remember candlelight dancing upon old log walls. I remember quilts stitched with loving hands. I remember rain tapping softly upon the roof while the fire whispered nearby. Those are the treasures that have stayed with me for 75 years. Funny, isn't it? The finest memories are rarely the costly ones. They're the quiet evenings, the familiar voices, the peaceful routines that gently tell a family, you are home. Perhaps that's why even now, whenever evening arrives, I find myself slowing down without thinking. I light a small lamp, I pour a warm cup of tea, I sit beside the fire whenever the weather allows. Sometimes I open the old family Bible. Sometimes I simply watch the flames for a little while. Not because I have to, because it reminds me where peace lives. It lives in simple things, in grateful hearts, in quiet homes, in evenings that are allowed to end gently instead of being hurried away. And as another peaceful night wrapped itself around the little pioneer cabin of my childhood, Grandfather's gentle wisdom continued to warm my heart, preparing me for one final good night, the kind that would linger softly long after the fire had faded and sleep had carried us into peaceful dream.
Now, my boy, the fire has grown quiet. The rain outside is softened until it is little more than a whisper upon the roof, and the night has wrapped its gentle arms around this old cabin once again. I reckon we've traveled a long way together this evening. Not across great mountains, not over rushing rivers, but through the peaceful memories of one ordinary pioneer family. And perhaps, in the end, That's exactly where the greatest treasures are found. You asked why our grandparents went to bed so early. Truth be told, it wasn't because life was smaller. It was because they understood that every part of the day had its own purpose. Morning belonged to hope. Afternoon belonged to honest work. Evening belonged to family. And the night, well, the night belonged to rest. They didn't see sleep as something that stole precious hours. They saw it as a blessing that prepared them to greet another sunrise with thankful hearts. Grandfather never measured a good day by how late he stayed awake. He measured it by whether he had loved well, worked honestly, spoken kindly, and remembered to thank the Lord before closing his eyes. Looking back after all these years, I believe that may have been his greatest lesson of all. A peaceful life isn't built in one grand moment. It's built in thousands of little evenings. One supper shared around a wooden table, one quiet prayer beside the fire, one page of scripture read by candlelight, one forgiven word before bedtime, one grateful heart resting upon a feather pillow. Those small moments, repeated day after day, quietly shaped a lifetime. I often wonder what Grandfather would think if he could sit beside us tonight. I imagine he'd smile beneath that silver beard of his, warm his hands near the fire, and say the very same words he spoke so many years ago. Silas, don't hurry the evening. I reckon that's advice worth carrying wherever life may lead. The evening was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to be enjoyed, to let your shoulders grow lighter, to let your breathing become slower, to let your thoughts settle like snowflakes upon a quiet field, to remember that not every question needs answering before morning, not every chore must be finished tonight. Some things can wait for the sunrise, and somehow the sunrise always arrives. As an old man now, I find myself following many of the same little habits I watched my grandparents keep. When the daylight begins to fade, I slow my steps. I thank the Lord for whatever the day has brought. Sometimes I read a few comforting verses from the old family Bible. Sometimes I simply sit and listen to the rain, to the wind, to the gentle crackling of a fire, to the quiet silence between each sound. I've learned that silence is never empty. If you listen carefully enough, it's filled with gratitude. It's filled with memories. It's filled with the quiet assurance that this world keeps turning just as the Lord intended. Tonight, as you sit here beside this old fireplace with me, perhaps you'll carry one small piece of this story into your own evening. Maybe you'll remember that rest is not laziness, it is a gift. Maybe you'll let the worries of tomorrow wait till tomorrow. Maybe you'll breathe a little slower, smile a little softer, and welcome the night as an old friend,
just as my grandfather always did. The fire is nearly asleep now. Only a few glowing embers remain, shining like tiny stars resting safely within the hearth. Outside, the rain continues its gentle lullaby. The trees sway peacefully beneath the night sky. The whole world seems to have settled into a calm, steady rhythm. So, my boy, pull that quilt just a little higher. Let its warmth wrap gently around your shoulders. Close your eyes whenever you're ready. Imagine the old cabin resting quietly beneath the stars, its chimney sending one last ribbon of smoke into the cool night air. Picture grandmother smiling as she straightens the quilts. Picture grandfather placing one final log upon the fading fire before whispering his familiar blessing. May the Lord watch over this house until morning. And now, my boy, I reckon it's time for this old storyteller to let the night finish the tale. Sleep peacefully, sleep deeply. May your heart be light, may your dreams be gentle, and may tomorrow greet you with the same quiet hope that greeted our grandparents each new dawn. Good night, my boy. The fire will keep watch a little while longer, and the morning will find us when it's meant to.